evening is a part of a series of 5 talks that we have organized from January to May of this year, as we have done many, many years in the past. I would like to let you know that the co-sponsors of this series, in addition to Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice, our main sponsor, is the University of Michigan's Latin America and Caribbean Studies department, a very important co-sponsor of ours, as well as the Huron Valley Democratic Socialists of America. And we're pleased to have community and university sponsors, co-sponsors with us. I want to draw your attention to the fact that we this is just the second in a series of 5, and you're in for a very informative and I'm sure warm and wonderful evening with Lisa Sullivan. Next month in March, also on the 15th of March, so 1 month exactly from today, we will have Jose Artiga, who is with the Share Foundation, and he'll be talking about social movements in El Salvador and Honduras and the situation in both of those places, which is pretty intense right now in both of those countries. In April, we'll have someone talking about Brazil and what's happening there. And in May, we will have John Gibler, a quite well-known journalist, talking about what is happening with the case of Ayotzinapa, Mexico, where 43 students were disappeared several years ago. So those are our upcoming, and we want you to know about those. And we invite you to join us for all of those. And I think that I hope that you've gotten the word of how to do that. But I think the flyer will also, someone will put that in the chat so that where you can sign up as you did for tonight. Each one you must register separately. So let's get started with tonight. And so we have Lisa talking about, and you see on the screen the title of her talk. I want you to know that during the talk and after the talk, there's opportunity to put questions in the chat. Rebecca will be assisting us in collating those questions and having them ready for Lisa in the discussion period of our time. So Lisa will talk tonight for however long she talks, and she's sharing a screen with us with some images that are important to her and to what she has to tell us. And anything that occurs to you, feel very free to put in the chat, and we will have a discussion afterwards. So Lisa Sullivan, I think that you have all read her bio. I know many of you know her very well, and she has a great bio. So if you haven't read it, do read it. I am not going to repeat everything in it, but I'm going to tell you my connection with Lisa, which is that we met in 1987 in Bolivia. Where we were both Maryknoll lay missioners. In fact, she had already been there a year and helped welcome us to Bolivia. And we overlapped there for a year or so, and then she and her family went on to Venezuela, where she has lived for the last at least 30 years, more than 30 years. And that's what she's going to talk to you about tonight. We caught up with each other. We made fast friends then. We caught up with each other later when she became the coordinator for School of the Americas Watch, the Latin America coordinator. And we went on to have many adventures together, along with many, many other people, some of whom are on this meeting tonight, taking delegations to many countries in Latin America to to interconnect with social movements that wanted to hear and needed to hear about the School of the Americas and what the role of the United States had been in many of the human rights violations in their countries and others. And so we became colleagues, but we have remained friends. And Lisa is an amazing worker for justice, and she's an amazing friend. And I will let her give you that experience this evening. So Lisa, it's all yours.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Marianne. It's really special to be invited to speak tonight. I was thinking, I've just been back about 7 months from Venezuela after maybe 35 years, and no one's really kind of said, tell the story. Many times I've given talks during different years about Venezuela, but to kind of look back on that journey in context of what's happening today in Venezuela, it just pulling this together was a really beautiful experience. And so I really appreciate you asking me to do this. I'm going to share really from the heart. Much of Venezuela's journey over the past 40 years has been my journey. I've intersected in some pretty amazing, extraordinary ways, and I'm really grateful for that. As hard as it is, it's the journey of my life more than any other journey, I'd say. So thanks for letting me share it. And it'll be, again, from that perspective, more of a personal perspective, not so much academics, but I hope I'll bring in a lot of information as well. I first went to Venezuela in 1982. I had already been in Latin America for, I think, about 5 years. I'd gone through my university. I'd lived in Mexico and Guatemala. I'd lived in Chile and mostly for several years in Colombia, where I met my husband, David, who's there on the left. And once we were pregnant with our first son, we decided to move to Venezuela to be near family. So in this picture, you see, I think I'm newly pregnant with our son, Mikel, and we're in his little town of Las Alhuacas. We settled in the eastern part of Venezuela. But I split the screen there because, interestingly enough, like right around the same time, the same year, and almost just a few months separate, a young military officer named Hugo Chávez did something that for him was very significant. He and a group of young military officers made a special declaration under a tree. It's called a saman tree, where Simón Bolívar had supposedly rested in Maracay. And they made a commitment to liberate Venezuela. And so it was right, no one knew of it at that time. Of course, it was many years later, but it was right around the same time that I was moving there to Venezuela in these years. Right after I had my son, Mikel, shown there in the middle, literally within weeks, something really significant happened in Venezuela. It's called now Black Friday, Viernes Negro. And Venezuela, as many of you probably know, is a huge oil producer. It has the biggest amount of oil reserves, proven oil reserves in the world. And so for 80 years, by the time I got to Venezuela, its economy was dependent on oil, and oil had gone up, oil had come down. And a decision was made on the government in the face of lowering oil prices to change the exchange rate. And from one day to the another, oil was worth half of what it was. And so that very much affected our lives. I was a young mom. I had gotten a job, and it was a decent salary. It was about $1,000 a month. I was able to travel to the US a couple times a year, but suddenly that was halved. And so we really felt on a personal level what that Viernes Negro really meant. And that, I would say, this event in 1982 kind of set off the following years for what we experienced in Venezuela. Several years later, I joined Maryknoll, as did Marianne. And after serving in Bolivia, we went back to Venezuela. And in Venezuela, we lived in the western part of the country, a city called Barquisimeto. And Venezuela was really going through, as I said, difficult times that were set off with that Viernes Negro, that spiraling down of the economy. And so, as you can see here, I'm visiting some friends. Many people lived in tin shacks, put together very precariously. And yet it was a country still of hope, I would say. It was a country still where, people felt like eventually they'd be able to build another home little by little. Their salaries in Christmas, their bonuses, they would buy a few cinder blocks, and little by little improve their homes. And so there was tremendous poverty. And yet there was a sense that, things could get better. But at the same time, frustration in a government that its oil reserves were increasingly not going to governments, to services, public services. An event took place in 1989. The frustration was mounting again in terms of money being reduced to services. And one day to another, the president of the country at the time, Carlos Andrés Pérez, declared an increase in gasoline prices. He had been elected a second time around. He had been president when there'd been a huge a surge in oil prices, and when they called it Saudi Venezuela. And so there was expectations, but literally within days of being inaugurated, he decided to raise the price of gasoline. People had gone to work that day. Many of them couldn't return. And suddenly the frustration just unraveled. And people started throwing rocks. People started burning cars. And just, violence just was unleashed in the form of the president sending troops to the streets. The military was sent into the streets that day. A time that was now known as the Caracazo. Over 3,000 people were killed. Maryknoll had many missioners working in barrios in Caracas, where many people were killed. And that day, the young military officer at the time, Hugo Chávez, happened to have chickenpox, so he did not take place in the military repression that took place. But many young military officers and other military people in the military were very frustrated that they were called into the streets to shoot upon what they saw as brothers and sisters, other people from poor and middle class communities who were just frustrated with years of spiraling down, and frustrated with this sudden rise in gasoline prices, transportation prices. And that was the military who was sent into the streets. We later learned Maryknoll was a participant in discovering many of the mass graves, a place that was called Peste. And probably around 3,000 people were killed over a set of about a week in this event called the Caracazo that really marked Venezuela from then on. I was in Barquisimeto. My husband had traveled to the eastern part of the country that day, so he was unable to get back for weeks because the roads were blocked. And so this set off a real time of the Caracazo really marked, I think, the Venezuelan spirit. The deaths then really was a time that people felt that Venezuela was on a new and very difficult track. Shortly after this event, that event had taken place in 1989. I happened to be in Caracas for some Maryknoll meetings. We have had our headquarters actually in a tall building at downtown Caracas. We had meetings talking about the difficult situation. In the middle of the night, we heard some explosions, some strange noises, airplanes, and looked out the balcony window and saw planes flying. And before we knew it, it was announced that an attempted coup had taken place. Those years, as I said, between the Caracazo and this moment, had been very filled with a lot of pain and a lot of anger, a lot of increase in. I'm losing my icon to be able to share. Here we go. So probably the government at the time would say their biggest mistake that they ever made was to put Hugo Chávez on the screen. He was on live TV. No one had any idea who he was. We asked each other, do you know who this guy is? No one knew. but he did two things that really, broke his role into history, Venezuelan history, opened his role. He admitted that he was responsible for this coup, and he admitted defeat. They were giving up their arms. But then he said something that people really grabbed onto. He said, "Por ahora hemos fracasado." For the moment, we have failed. And so that term "por ahora" kind of became a buzzword for Venezuela, I would say really for 4 or 5 years, por ahora. In other words, the change that Venezuelans had been desiring to happen did not take place with this coup. I think many people afterwards said they were glad it didn't. Venezuela had been a democracy since 1958. But there was a desire for deep change, and it lay with the people that concept of por ahora, so, maybe not now, but later. So Chávez and the other young officers that were responsible were put in jail. There you see, it's interesting, the background, that's them in jail. They were able to have many visitors, and they really took advantage of that time. They read, and they had visitors from all around the country, which is another interesting thing that the government allowed. And so obviously they had made a lot of contact, made a lot of organizing during their time in jail. 2 years later, there was presidential elections, and Rafael Caldera was elected because he promised to release Chávez. And so kind of based on that, he was elected president, and sure enough, Chávez was released from jail. Then began a really interesting moment for me, and I think this was, one of the really beautiful moments in Venezuela, where people said, it's a good thing, that this coup didn't take place. We really want something change to happen by democracy. And so there was the concept of, well, let's start a new constitution. Let's write a new constitution. Let's participate in what are our dreams for this country. And so when Chávez was released from jail, he ran a campaign for the 1998 presidential elections. This is one of the many parties that put him as this candidate. Ran mostly on the concept of, okay, we want change, the coup didn't work, and now, but let's look at a way of doing this through democracy. And so a call for rewriting a new constitution. Chávez was elected, and indeed the process of the constitution took place. It was a really vibrant set of years. I would say initially, right after Chávez was elected, this is just me my life was a lot doing music with the kids, but there was a lot of energy in the country, a lot of excitement. It's a new moment. There was a refounding. It was called the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, kind of a new moment. And so again, it was just a tremendous energy. So I'm talking in 2000, the year 2000 was when the refounding, the Constitution passed. Kind of a really exciting time. And yet it was a very divided time. And here we have the split screen. While on one hand, many of us, and I'll say I was one person who had not really been excited about a military person coming to presidency, but I was really pulled along by many of my neighbors who felt like there was hope. This was somebody who was really trying to bring change to the country, trying to bring the oil resources to social programs, and yet it was such a divided country. And so that division began to really, ramp up, and an event took place on April 11th, 2002, in which there were parallel marches in the streets of Caracas, massive marches of the opposition, massive marches of the Chávez supporters. And suddenly shots ran out at a place called Puente Llaguno. People were killed. And the next thing we knew, we were told that Chávez had resigned. I was away in Bolivia for a meeting. I remember calling my kids saying, it doesn't seem like he's someone who would resign. It was just announced. That was the fact. Again, this was April 11th. Trying to find my mouse. There you go. Well, that event took only 2 days to turn around, and it was quite an extraordinary time. Many people felt like this is not something that we will believe in. We don't, we were the one who elected this person. We're the ones who are to determine whether this will stand or not. And so people massively across the country took to the streets. I was returning on a plane from Bolivia. It was quite interesting. I was returning thinking I was returning to Chavez in jail. And as we were approaching the airport, the pilot said, well, I'm not sure if we're going to land. We might have to turn around, go back to Colombia. It looks like the roads are blocked. We're not sure. Are you guys okay if we need to turn around at the last minute? We kind of took a poll and we said, okay, yeah, let's land no matter what it's like. We landed at the airport. There was no need to take our passport. We couldn't quite figure it out. I got in one of the last cabs and went through the streets of Caracas on the middle of the night of April 13th, passing just massive amounts of people gathered around fires and people in the streets. And what had happened is that in the end, the military at the time decided to go and return Chavez to power. And so they were sent to the island where he'd been kept, brought him back. And as I entered the Maryknoll Center House, I saw the helicopter returning him to the presidential palace. And, the whole city exploded. It was quite an extraordinary time, a sense that we really, turned this around, a sense of people power. When Chavez had been swept away on April 11th, there was a self-declared president who was Pedro Carmona. He was sworn in. He was the business leader, the head of the commerce, and he basically swore himself in as president. It was clear that the U.S. right away recognized this new government, this very brief government. They had met with him only weeks ahead. They'd met with the head of the military that also swept Chavez away. So this really began a totally new moment for Venezuela on two levels. It was now clear that the U.S. involvement was really palpable, and that the U.S. would really kind of do anything to not have Chavez there. And it became a moment when a country became even more divided. On the other hand, it was a time when there was an abundance of what we called the misiones. It was kind of a pact after the coup take place, which I think Chavez realized he really needed to do something with the people and for the people, but in a major level. And so one after another, almost every few months, a new mission was born. There was the education missions. There was they were called missions because they wanted them to be swift, to go to get improvements to a particular sector like education or healthcare immediately, and not wait for bureaucratic reform. And so this was a time for me that was, again, really beautiful to see neighbors. Many of my neighbors took part in the educational missions. Older women who'd never learned to read and write, or people, it went into what they call the Robinson mission, to elementary school. Other people had to leave their education to have babies, go on and get their high school degree. The schools were turned into universities at nights and on weekends. It was just a time of real flourishing, of people participating, of people's sense of hope. There was a mission even for trees. There was a mission for handicapped people. There was a mission for building housing. And millions of homes were built, including in my little community, where a census was taken and determined who really needed the houses, and houses were built. So a real time of hope for many. And this was accomplished through oil. As I said, Venezuela has the largest reserves of oil in the world, 308 billion barrels. There we go. So in 1998, when this was happening, they were booming in oil. 3.8 million barrels were being produced per day. And really, these missions were funded by oil. And again, these were the years of Chavez's massive amounts of support on one hand, and also growing frustration, I'd say, on the other. But he was a very visible figure. Marches were enormous. And in this time, all of a sudden my life kind of intersected oddly with President Chavez. Father Roy Bourgeois, who you see there in the photo, called me up one day and or communicated and said, "Hey, Lisa, I want to meet with Chavez." And I'm like, "Hey, Roy, I do too, but I have no idea how to get to the president." And one thing led to another. We were able to meet with the vice president, and Roy put bluntly to the vice president, the issue of his burning issue was that he wanted Chavez to pull troops from the School of the Americas. And fortunately, we had a press conference afterwards, and Chavez himself heard the press conference and invited us to meet with him. It was extraordinary. It was the first of many times I actually met with Chavez. He was different in many ways than what I thought, and I'd say perhaps the way I found most different was that as great a speaker as he was a great listener. He was really fascinated by the story of the School of the Americas Watch, the movement, the protests, the vigil, people going to prison for civil disobedience, for bringing attention to the situation. So he was really, I think, moved by this movement, totally unaware of it. And when we asked him would he withdraw troops, he said he'd think about it. Didn't tell us yes right away, but within a few weeks he did make the announcement through the vice president and withdrew Venezuelan troops from the School of the Americas. And this was a time when there was tremendous connection between Venezuela and many other countries. Many other countries were experiencing tremendous change. The left was rising in power. And so there's a lot of connections, especially through an organization called ALBA. But that really allowed us to begin to visit some of these other presidents. Chavez had taken the step of pulling out Venezuelan troops from the School of the Americas. And together with Marianne and Roy, we started visiting different countries. We ended up visiting 10 different countries and trying to meet with the president. Many times we did, and asking for them to withdraw troops from the School of the Americas. And we were quite successful. I think about 7 agreed. Many later changed their minds. But it was, I think, an example of that moment of real, you should see her in the picture, kind of the, I don't see it here, but the upside down is the sense of the South is now the North. And there's a sense of, rising unity between Latin America and rising independence from the United States. I also had the opportunity to organize the first big event for Chavez in New York City. It was pretty shocking to me. It was 2005, and I had to set up an event in a church in Manhattan, and how many people in the U.S. wanted to come and see him. And so I think, again, there was just a sense of this is a new sense of hope. This is a sense of something different. This is a sense of, empowering the poor, empowering the South. As many we all know, Chavez later got cancer, and died in 2013. The following, as soon as Chavez died, he had asked that people vote for Maduro. All of us were so devastated, really, by Chavez's death. Again, because there'd been such a time of hope, such a time of organization, improvement in people's lives, such a real palpable sense of that. I think that people just kind of were numb. And there was an election. Maduro took supposedly 50%, and Capriles supposedly 49%. Many would question if that was the real results, but it was accepted. And so there kind of unfolds, I think, the story of today. Once Maduro was in power, Maduro did not have the charisma of Chavez. Maduro did not have the military context that Chavez had. And on top of that, oil prices in the world were coming down. And oil production in Venezuela was coming down because of so much money from the oil industry going into emissions, going into everything but really, propping up the industry itself. And so I have a picture of the Venezuelan parliament here, and some really significant things. The parliamentary elections took place in 2015, and for the first time, of any election since Chavez had come on the scene, the opposition won, runs strongly. They had 109 delegates compared to the Venezuela's Maduro's party, the PSUV, the Socialist Party, 55. I was bringing a delegation. It was one thing that I had done for many years at that point, was to start to bring delegations to Venezuela. There was a lot of, again, excitement to see what was happening, and it really allowed me to travel to many places in Venezuela and see many of the missions and really get a sense of that change. But the opposition won very strongly, but it wasn't long before the Supreme Court took away 4 seats with different reasons, that apparently elections were not correct. And that took away their superpower majority, which would allow them to veto, makes all sorts of changes. This unleashed tremendous upheaval, tremendous protest in the streets. Something was later called the guarimbas, very powerful protests, but also protests where it was, hard to leave our homes. So people were frustrated on one hand with what was happening in the government. People were frustrated on the other hand with the protesters. It was a time of just deep divisions beginning to become entrenched. And so in March 2017, the Congress, the Supreme Court actually dissolved the Congress. And a process of recall referendum began against Maduro. And just days within that process, again, the Supreme Court took away that possibility. So here's a image of one of the many protests that was taking place at the time. And a way to overcome this, Maduro has proved to be a very skilled, I would say, quarterback, to kind of know how to take the ball to duck, to do things. And one thing he did that really avoided this situation was to call another constitutional referendum. In that way, he was able to abolish Congress, set up a new Congress, a new assembly. And here we have him looking very triumphant. In 2018, there was another presidential election. This time it was pretty clear that there was not much support of Maduro, but again, being that wise or skilled quarterback, what he was able to do was to take away the participation of the 2 main candidates, to decertify them. And frustrated by that, the opposition decided not to participate in the elections. And of course, Maduro was reelected. Then this person came on the scene to the surprise of all of us. In early 2019, all of a sudden, in the midst of the frustration with Maduro, a young man named Juan Guaido, who was actually the president of the assembly that was really no longer functioning, declared himself president. A self-declared president, which immediately, within minutes, the United States recognized him. It gave them the perfect out to now say this is the true president of Venezuela, as followed by the majority of countries, especially in Europe, to now declare Guaido, who'd only declared himself president. Now, most of us had no idea who this person was, and yet it was quite a divided country. Some people, I'd say, supported him just as a possibility of having any kind of change. And many people did not. They didn't know who he was. So here kind of unfolds the story of the past several years. It's a story of spiraling down. And one of the many things that has happened in Venezuela over the past few years is electricity. Because of, well, I think I should step back for a minute. There's another slide ahead of time that talks about U.S. sanctions. The U.S. at the same time decided to put economic sanctions on Venezuela, which means, as with Cuba, that really cut Venezuela off almost completely from the international market, unable to sell its oil and unable to have that income. What happens? Well, they can't invest in electricity, they can't invest in food, they can't invest in schools. And so it's obvious the squeeze really began to be felt. And so this image is really familiar for all of us. In Venezuela, still, by the time I left, we have our lights turned off every other day at night, 3 or 4 hours. And so we always have something to see whether it's, candles or solar powered flashlights or something, but we've kind of almost gotten used to it. It's what it is in Venezuela. This is again the issue of sanctions. It's really brought Venezuela to its knees. And oil, meanwhile, not only is there sanctions, but the oil output in Venezuela was so much, was the source of the economy. Over 90% of the economy was dependent on oil. And the oil output went from about 3.8 million barrels of oil a day when Chavez was elected to the last count in January was only 600,000 barrels of oil a day. So that's not even talking about selling oil, it's producing it. So it's about a fourth of what it was when Chavez was first elected. Again, many people feel because of that inability to put money back into the oil industry. So since Venezuela can't sell oil to the US, it finds other people to buy and who've also invested. And so China especially has invested tremendously in Venezuela. I think Venezuela owes its life for probably 100 years to China for the amount of loans it's received that they pay back in oil. And similarly, Russia and Iran. And of course, I mean, the U.S. has pushed Maduro into the arms of these countries. What do? You've got to support a country, you people, and so you have to find a way to have some kind of income. And so those alliances came because of that. Here we have a box that's really important in all of our lives. And again, I'd say this is where Maduro's really brilliance, in being able to survive was realizing that if people have a little bit of food, at least they'll have a little bit of food and maybe I can stay in power. Maybe, they'll put up with things. And so as food began to disappear, I should have photos here, but I don't, begin to disappear from our shelves. There was, beginning in 2017, 2018, tremendous lack of just food to purchase in the country. The country had also not really invested in agriculture. It had been investing in missions and houses and this and that, but had not really invested into agriculture. And so food had continued to be imported. And without the funds, because of sanctions, there was no way to import the amounts. It was just drastically reduced. And so suddenly, even if you had some money, there was nothing to buy. There's literally nothing to buy. And so this concept of getting just enough food to give every household this box, it's called CLAP. It's a community project where you have to sign up to be part of it, but pretty much everyone in the country and through their community is able to receive this box, which allows you to minimally survive. In the face of so many people in our community really being devastated by this the situation of food, especially. I mean, there's no way to exaggerate how that affected all of us. All of us dropped 10 pounds, 20 pounds. People dropped 40 pounds. People were able to eat 2 meals and 1 meal a day. And so in the face of this, you ask yourself, what do I do? What do we do? I decided at that point to leave SOA Watch. I felt like it was the time to be back in Venezuela. I had been in and out of Venezuela, but I decided to go back. And I had a little farm that I had been building for years, and with my partner Ledys. And one day, this young woman named Fabi, one of the great giants in my life, she would often visit me, and we love to plant together or whatever. And one day she said, "Hey, Feliz, we were planting a mango tree," and she said, "When are we going to start planting something that turns into food more quickly?" And I realized, right, mango tree takes 5 years, and she was hungry. The kids were always hungry. And so I said, "Okay, Fabi, you can use my land, come tomorrow or whatever, and let's find a way to start doing some more food gardens." And so Fabi showed up the next day, really early in the morning with her cousin, Joan. And then she showed up the next day with her siblings, and the next day with more cousins. Anyway, little by little, she gathered a group, Fabi, the great Fabi, and the kids started coming to my land. And it was a beautiful set of maybe 3 or 4 years that paralleled this hunger crisis in Venezuela. And really is my source of hope when you say what, it was just a terrible time. And yet just to see these kids as their parents were waiting in lines or trying to figure out when they get a clap box, putting their all into growing food. And so it became a really extraordinary learning experience for me too, about how to grow all sorts of food. Here's some of the girls with parchita, passion fruit. There's Fabi to the left. She was always the powerhouse, Fabi. And as they would grow food, they would share it together, and we would always end a session of planting by eating food that we'd grown. Bananas became very important in my life. Sometimes I'd wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning just to plant another banana tree because, they have so many calories. You don't think about this until you really need the calories. And so here's some of the kids in our little group with some of the bananas they harvested. And chickens, we started to raise chickens, and the kids, each got chickens for their own households. There's another young woman, Nazaret, who just has a tremendous amount of spirit too. And so here she is planting some seeds. We became really aware of the need for authentic seeds, for local seeds. When you can't import seeds, you need to start sharing seeds. And so we really got into identifying seeds, collecting seeds from our neighbors, different kinds of seeds, talking about seeds, naming seeds, experimenting with different. We each even came up with we would identify with one seed. What is your seed? How do you identify? And so the kids became passionate about seeds. They recognize seeds for growing food. Here they are sharing those, and really, really beautiful process. And they would grow some of their seeds. We'd use everything we could. And here's it's a banana, what we call the bastago, the stalk of the banana we turn into a seed bed. Look, what do you call those little, for planting our seeds, a seed starter. And there's the older kids started working with some of the younger kids. And here again, planting a banana plant, which are just such bananas. If any of you've planted them, they're just so generous. They're kind of like Latinos, they give out their hijos, their children all around them, and they're just so easy to grow. You pull out one of their children and you just put it in a hole and you plant it again. And so just a tremendous crop. Here I am with the kids, some of the greens that they grew. Another thing that we had to learn to do was to, I'm a coffeeaholic, so I started growing my own coffee, but growing coffee is a long process, and one of the processes that you have to do is to remove it from the shell from the bean. And so this is the process we would do. Pilando. You can pilar maíz, or that's pilando. So here's Ledy, my partner at the left, and if any of you know Ledy, he's very skinny here compared to, he's usually quite a hardy guy, but all of us had lost several, I'd say 10 or 20 pounds during this time. Here's Ledy. Working in the compost pile and kind of showing the difficult times. We also started raising sheep, even though I'm a vegetarian. It was great for the sheep with the kids. We would be able to now and then, every couple of months, have a sheep stew. And here we are. Another thing, we really were unable to have, very difficult to find any kind of combustion, whether it was gasoline or gas. We used to cook with gas canisters, but for years it was just impossible to get. And so what do? We cooked over an open fire. And here's a young woman named Mamari, another young woman, tremendous spirit. We would make a group meal, and here's Mamari with the fire, making the group meal. And we learned to put bananas in everything. And so these are actually green bananas, plantains turned into arepas, because Venezuelans, of course, can't live without arepas. So often we couldn't get corn. So here we are making arepas out of green bananas. At the same time, many of our basics were missing. So one thing that was missing was soap. You couldn't get soap. My son Pachi there in red is a chemist. And he was living in Venezuela at the time, and was newly married, or I guess it was before he was getting married, but he just started making soap. And so people were really interested in learning. Here he is at an event that we held we began to gather young adults, and we would call it the sharing of our wisdom, because we began to have to make everything. There was very little anything that could be bought, purchased, and so we would each person would kind of share something that they knew well how to do. But I want to put Pachi here too, because I think that's a segue to another moment that began to happen in Venezuela, and I think it's the reason why many people in the US are now kind of noticing Venezuela, and that's the issue of migration. And my son Pachi had hoped to lead his life in Venezuela. But when he got married, his beautiful wife, Oriana, she's a scientist. She's a biologist. Here she is graduating from her first master's degree. And when she started her first job, she was excited to get a job in a great lab in the university there. She was constantly doing experiments, actually to get her master's degree, and it stretched out her master's into 2, into 3, into 4 years. And the real reason was because there was not enough rat food. If there was barely enough people food, there was no dog food. And so many of the laboratories were experiencing the same thing. Her rats would die. She'd have to start again. Something we don't often think about, but that was something that she faced. And then she did graduate, got her master's degree. Here she is with her medal at the ceremony. But as she started her first job, little by little, her bus fare to her work was more expensive than her salary. Now, this is a woman with a master's in biology. And so Pachi and Ori were, with their dreams in Venezuela. He owns an apartment in Venezuela. They decided they had to leave. They couldn't really survive. They applied for a visa to the United States. She was turned down once. She was turned down twice. She was turned down 3 times. Again, they're married, and she has a master's in biology, but she was turned down. So they decided to go to Spain, where they are now. But, I think they're just 2 people of what we now know are about 7 million people. It was the beginning of the Great Migration. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. In Venezuela had been a country of receiving people. The Venezuela that my kids knew in their classes were Italians, were Portuguese, were Spaniards, were people from Hong Kong. Venezuela was a country that had its arms open to other nations. At first, many who left after World War II came and made their lives in Venezuela. Many from Palestine, from Syria came. Many from Latin America, Colombia, Peru, to work in Venezuela, where the economy was really booming for many years. And so Venezuela really had no problem welcoming people. It was just, and I often felt that I never really stood out in Venezuela because there's people from all over. It was a very welcoming country, a very diverse country. And it was not a country where people left. And all of a sudden people started to leave. Again, they started with the professionals, like my other kids had already left. They had not really, their professions had not kept them in Venezuela. But Pachi, my son, and his wife Oriana, among that first wave of professionals, really leaving and realizing there's no space for us here. And after that, just the lack of food, trying to find food for their families, Venezuelans started leaving, and literally a great many of Venezuelans who have left have walked to their new destination. Millions have gone to Colombia. From Colombia, many went on to Ecuador, to Peru, to Chile. In our community, a tiny community in the rural area, we have hundreds of friends who've left to different destinations, and that was their only way of surviving and sending money, as we all know that story too well from Central America. But that was not Venezuela's story. It was a very new story for us, and so in some ways a very quiet story. Mostly they went to other Latin American countries, and so there was not a lot of hullabaloo, and quietly went and walked and have made their lives there. And so, the expression on this woman's face is what we all know, having your possessions there. At this point, Venezuela, about 1/4 of its population has left. 7 million people out of a population of 28 million people. It's the biggest migration really in the world at this point. It's massive. And so for the most part, people have gone to other countries of Latin America. Then a new wave started recently. I was going to add a photo. I didn't get a chance. My son Pachi's best friend, William, who's living with us here. He's at our house. He was one of the new waves where people all of a sudden realized, oh, people had a little bit thought, well, maybe we can go to the US because the US was not imposing Title 42 on Venezuelans. They were turning everybody else at the border, but because the US did not have relations with Venezuela, they couldn't really process the return of them. So that kind of opened the doors to the idea of some Venezuelans coming to the US. Many went through the very difficult Darien Pass. The Darien is a zone between Colombia and between South America and Central America. It used to be thought of as impenetrable. It's a jungle. It's just brutal. And so Venezuelans started going to the border of Colombia and Panama and just going through this jungle. And just tens of thousands have done that in recent months. Maryknoll's sisters work in the Darien in Panama and sent out a plea to help because they were receiving so many hundreds of people a day pouring through this jungle, desperate people, just to get to Panama. And then from Panama got on up to the United States. But this is just it's desperation, when you go through a jungle like this. And many, many people have died in the process and whose bodies are still there. Most of the bodies are not retrieved. And so I'm guessing that many communities have seen Venezuelans, have received Venezuelans in recent months, like those passing through the Darien. And, the U.S. decided to act on that. And rather than letting Venezuelans through, they had turned other people around because of Title 42. Venezuelans were allowed in, but that changed in January when it was decided. It was actually changed in October. And then in January, yet another change. But before that, I'll tell you my story. My son's best friend, Will, who he came through and he turned himself in at the border. This was shortly before this new regiment, and he's here. And so the new wave, a wave of Venezuelans for a period of maybe a year, are really have been able to come through and been able to try to pursue political asylum. He's one of them. But starting with this new decree in January, President Biden is now turning back Venezuelans who show up at the border. They cannot ask for asylum, no matter what the situation. And they must apply for asylum only from Venezuela, not from any other country. And they must have a U.S. sponsor. So they're promising to process up to 30,000 Venezuelans in this new process. Of course, those conditions make it difficult for the majority of Venezuelans. Majority of Venezuelans don't have somebody in the U.S. Venezuela has not been a traditionally country that has a footprint in the U.S. Like many Central American countries, is they don't have anybody to sponsor them, and so it's been a way of really cutting off the possibility of political asylum for Venezuelans, because most Venezuelans don't have that person in the United States who's willing to say fiscally sponsor that person. Here I'm holding up a paper because I want to kind of, as I wind it down, tell my own journey of migration. So I had been in Venezuela, had a residence visa for decades. At one point, with President Chávez, who I met many times. I was on his TV show. At one point, he said, "Lisa, what you need to nationalize yourself," And I just never took the time to do it. And so I was a resident. And my residency was up about a year ago, and the offices were closed because of the pandemic. And finally, when I traveled to Caracas many times to get my residency renewed, it just wasn't renewed. I would go, they'd say, come back in 2 weeks. I'd come back, they'd say, there's not an answer. I'd come back a month later, and meanwhile, we're trying to travel in a country where it's almost impossible to travel because there's no gasoline. So things that seem so easy in the US are not easy in Venezuela. So finally, I realized they're not going to renew my visa. And I began to ask around others. There was others like myself who'd been 20, 30, 40 years in the line. They were Spaniards, they were Portuguese, they were Italian. And we realized they wanted money. And so some people offered 3,000, that wasn't enough. 5,000, that wasn't enough. Some people offered more, up to 10,000. And so that seemed to be enough to get their residency. And I decided, I can't afford that. And, this is a country I've given my life to. So it was a really emotional time. This was this last summer. I was neither able to get my visa renewed, but then I wasn't able to leave the country either. They wouldn't give me a permit to leave. So here I am holding in a very kind of sad but happy way my permit to leave. But I knew when I left, I wouldn't be able to come back, at least for a while. I don't know when I'll be able to come back because people from the US need a visa. And there's no Venezuelan embassy in the US. It's a very complex process. And so pretty much they turned down anybody trying to come to the US from Venezuela. So that was a really difficult moment, not really knowing what I was going to do. And so one of the pictures I'll end on here is to say that, again, like a lot of my life that's paralleled kind of the really critical moments of Venezuela is my life as a migrant and my family. So here's my original family. We're now in 5 countries, 5 of us. My ex-husband and continuing very dear friend, David, is in Venezuela. My daughter, Maya, is in France with her husband and 2 children. My son, Pachi, is with his wife in Spain. He's a chef. Ledys and I up to the right, we're here in the US. I never would have imagined Ledys, my partner, coming to the US. In my wildest dreams, but here he is to accompany me. And then on the bottom right is my son, Miguel, who's gone to London. His family will soon be following. So here we are, family of 5 in 5 different countries. And that's really the story of Venezuela right now. So I wanted to end, one perhaps different moment and hope maybe the US has allowed Chevron to go back to pump oil. It's the first time they've allowed, a US company to operate. They give some hope there may be relief from sanctions. Another hope is that the prisoners that were some of the leaders of Citco were recently released. And so oddly enough, these 2 oil company signatures, which as somebody who works against fossil fuels, it's hard to say that's hopeful, but it's hopeful that perhaps it could be in sight a diminishing of sanctions, which would mean everything for Venezuelans. And then I'm just going to end. I actually sent a message to these friends who are really important people in my life, asking for words of hope. Their lives are really, really hard, and but they had no trouble sending me words of hope. Just going to share the top here. That's Juan Carlos, the young man up at the top left. He's one of our partners in crime with working with kids, and a lot of his hope had to do with, in spite of everything, there's still incredible community efforts. He's part of a really significant cooperative movement called Seco Se Sola, which has just refused to give up and continues to work together. The young woman here to the left, that's Nazaret, planting a mango tree. And she talked about how she recently graduated from high school, and she was told she had to wait a year to even try to study, but she's now going to school. College is maybe a weekend, now and then they give them classes, but she said her hope is in young people who have stayed. So many have left, but who have stayed. And there is kind of a new moment where many young people are trying, so many of the traditional business people of Venezuela, the Spaniards, the Italians, the Portuguese have left. And so there's just this really tiny efforts at very minute kind of business. And so, she's one of those people, whether it's selling eggs or something, just to some kind of initiative. And here's in the middle, a young woman named Marlene, who has a radio show. And, one of the things that's been really hard about Venezuela is the inability, there's no longer newspapers, there's really inability to speak out. And yet she has a community radio show, and she feels like, that ability to at least share the voices of others. And then to the bottom right is Jenny. She's my neighbor. Jenny and I wore a path to each other's homes especially during the hunger times. Whatever we had, we would share daily with one another. And her spirit is just always so bold and so bright. And so she's another person, that sense of neighborness. I think in Venezuela, it's a country where your neighbor, to everybody, and that sharing has really allowed people to survive. And I think it's what will allow us to go forward. So that is kind of the end of the presentation, and I welcome questions. And I think I'm supposed to stop sharing my screen, right, Marianne?
If you can, if you're able, that would be great.
I did it.
Good. Look at that.
Now I get to see these great faces. Oh my gosh. Hello,
Yes.
friends.
And everyone
right.
can see
I've
you.
not seen it was there. Oh my gosh. Good to
Well,
see
I'm
you.
going to go right ahead into the questions since we already have a few and that people have posted in the chat. And so I invite others, if you have a question, to put in the chat. And if you would like to ask it yourself, you can use the raise hand function. Otherwise, I won't be able to see you. So, so first, Gary asked Lisa, and he said, Venezuela is a vast country with diverse resources. Why did the Maduro government early on not focus on developing agricultural capacity and other mineral development, something like FDR did during the Depression?
Yeah, great question, Gary. Thank you. That really started, it didn't start with Maduro and didn't even start with Chavez. It started with oil. And, oil is just, as we call it, the devil's excrement in Venezuela, because it's so easy to have oil. It's easy to just, pull out from the earth. It's easy to then use those funds to import food. And so, unfortunately, that's been the model for Venezuela for 50, 60 years. I'd say, especially once it became a quote democracy. And so, Chavez really talked a lot about reviving the agricultural sector. But, I think also when you're up against the wall, it was a very divided country and the US was doing all it could to bring him down. I think a lot of effort was given to just, sadly, trying to keep people happy, but in making sure that they had their food box, making sure that they have what they call these bonuses. People get these really minimal, maybe $2-3 bonuses a month every time they get it. It's given a different name. And so rather than really invest in the long-term strategy. And so because of that, the agricultural sector is just really gone downhill. And then on top of that, it was a time when seeds were imported and fertilizers were imported. And so not only can, you don't have the dollars, you don't have, through sanctions, you can't import any of those things. And so all that has really gone by the wayside. And I don't see any effort whatsoever on Maduro to trying to change that. He just wants to try to keep a little tiny box of food in front of people's, in front of them. The question of minerals, it leads to another important thing to share. Because of the lack of funds through oil, because of the sanctions, Maduro has started devastating, and I mean devastating, the country in the search for minerals, and especially the southeast part of the country, very pristine jungle, beautiful area, is just being destroyed in what they call the arco minero. It's about a fifth of the country that they're eking out all sorts of minerals and selling them in the black market, anything to get dollars into the country. The military is very involved in this, and so they are trying to diversify the country rather than oil going for minerals, but in a very similarly very negative way.
Thank you. Mary Jo asks, is there any legislation coming up in the US to stop the sanctions of Venezuela, and how can we support the effort? And she also says, any chance for ecotourism?
I don't know of any legislation calling for an end to sanction. I know certain organizations have put out a plea, but I don't know if that's actually turned into any kind of potential bill. I think it's been an unusual time because of the war in Ukraine. Even some Republicans are saying, kind of on the side, let's bring in some Venezuelan oil. It's right around the country where, the world needs oil now that, Russia's not in the picture. And because of that, the US for the first time sent a delegation several months ago to meet with Maduro. which was shocking because they supposedly don't consider Maduro to be the president. I forgot to mention that Guaido is no longer the official president because his own party has dispensed him. So I don't know who the U.S. calls the president of Venezuela at this point, but the fact that they re-upped Chevron's license to work there shows that I think they really are hungry for Venezuelan oil, but because it's a market that's really devastated, there's not a lot of production at this point. So the call for sanctions, I think there's, I don't know of a bill, but I do think there's certain people think there might be some hope with this Chevron situation. And recently Venezuela did release a few significant political prisoners. And so maybe that is their effort to inch towards some kind of dialogue, but it could go on a lot longer as well.
Thanks. Some more questions from Gary. When did you begin to realize after Chavez died that the transition to Maduro was not going to work? Do you think it was only the US sanctions, or was it a failure of Chavez to build the political structures and an effective successor? Oil rebounded. What is your opinion about why the Chavez project failed after his death?
Those are great questions to see if I can hold them all in my head. You know, Maduro is a whole different personality. I did have the chance to spend quite a bit of time with him. Interestingly enough, when President Zelaya was taken out of power in Honduras and several years later returned, Father Roy and I were asked to accompany him along with other ambassadors from Latin America. And Maduro led that delegation. It was prior to becoming president. And we spent about a week in a lot of events together. And it was clear he was not the person that Chavez said, that quality I talked about, being a listener. He really needed any opportunity, I think, to be approved of, to gain attention. And so I think when Chavez died, and I will say that Chavez left a lot of problems. I'm not going to put it all on Maduro. But Maduro neither had the charisma, didn't have the military connections, didn't have the vision, Chavez was able to pivot amazingly. He would see a situation, he would create, he would say, you know, this is happening. So let's have a new mission. And so people would get motivated. The next morning, people were waking up and wanting to be part of this mission. There's just an ability to energize people. And Maduro does not have that gift. But he was also left with a lot of situations. And I think one of the main ones was that Chavez was this charismatic figure that everybody was around. And so there wasn't a creation of leadership around him. And as years went on, that leadership, I think, started to tend towards what I would call authoritarianism, even under Chavez. And so that was what Maduro inherited. There was not really a participative government or participative sense of lower level leaders at all, a real void. And so that's what we have today. It's really a void of political leadership. And of course, added to that, if you do speak out, you often ends up in jail anyway. So it's not an easy scenario in which to or conducive to other leaders as well.
I think you got all those questions. Marianne asks, do you consider the situation right now to be as bad as it was when you talked about the period of incredible hunger and lack of food? Have things gotten a little bit better, or are they still the same today?
That's a great question. And I would definitely say things are better. You know, it was all quite sudden, our plunge into darkness, sudden and unexpected and total. You know, the oil reserves, like I said, the oil income just was in those years used to pay towards the debt and not towards any of these resources. And so the hunger was just really stunning. So in the past, I think 2 years, one thing that Maduro wisely decided to do was to let go of the exchange rate controls. You know, in addition to the hunger, we had this massive inflation that broke world records. I don't know if we got to 40,000, 100,000, you know, I don't know what it was, but one day to the next, money was worthless, absolutely worthless. We'd have stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of bills to try to pay for anything. And of course, the banks didn't have enough bills. And so, and the reason that was allowed to spiral, and Maduro took many years to put control of that, because it was a huge business for people in the government. The official exchange rate was, let's say, 100 to 1, but on the streets it was 1,000,000 to 1, or something. It almost got to those kind of proportions. And so it did, because we kept cutting off zeros. But so anybody in the government who had access to official funds could buy, let's say, with 10 bolivares, $1, and other people needed 100,000 to buy $1. And so that was an enormous cash cow for people within the government for years. And they accrued massive amounts of wealth, and what they call the burguesia, those in Maduro's current circle, which is a kind of a limited group, people who keep trading hats. This month you'll be Minister of Education, and next month you'll be Minister of, just kind of take turns. But massive wealth was accumulated through this exchange control. And so surprisingly, Maduro a few years ago let go of that. And that was really quite important to putting a stop to the runaway inflation. There's still quite a bit of inflation, way more than, we complain here, but way more than here, but nothing like what it was like. And the fact that so many people had begun to leave. And I think this really is another entire change to the situation, is that people began to leave and send money back home. And so that really is what Venezuelans are surviving off of, that little bit of money that they're able to send back. So our little friend Nasa talked about, people can have a little bit of money and set up a little bit of a business. And so another thing was that small businesses were kind of allowed to happen, and they didn't ask them for, 100 different permits from bureaucracy. And so I think it's given, Maduro space to allow the economy to grow a little bit. So it's definitely, while it's very, very difficult, and salaries are extremely low, a teacher makes $30 a month. It's not as bad as it was, for sure. Several years ago, it was really just tragic.
I think that Mary Jo I know she speaks for me, and I think she speaks for most of us when she thanks you for your fascinating presentation. The personal stories were so powerful as a backdrop to the political story. She's inspired by your farm and the people who are learning about farm resources and are building a beautiful community. So I was wondering, I want to let people know that a while ago you were blogging about your personal story, but you would bring in the national, international story. Are you doing that again, or are you planning to do that again?
I have not written anything since I got back. There was just a real open wound. And so for when I was writing a lot, I think especially before the pandemic, it was my outlet and my joy, really. I was inspired by so many of these kids, just extraordinary, inspiring. And then after the pandemic, many of you know, we've been through a lot here in my own family, loss of my daughter's baby. And when we went back, at that point, we began to have problems with internet, with lights. And so all these really difficulties, even being able to communicate for Venezuelans, just to be able to be online, to be able to have lights is really hard. And so that kind of put a damper, and then coming back to the US. So I've really not been writing lately. I think it's more out of having left, and, just kind of healing from that, just surprising. I never imagined my life not to be in Venezuela. And so just to kind of grasp that, I think, before maybe taking that up again. But yeah, thanks to those who kept up with our blog.
And for those who haven't had a chance to read them, I'm sure you can find them, because everything stays.
Everything's findable. It's called Lisa's Venezuela, the blog, I think. And I share a lot of really, really beautiful stories. Of some extraordinary people. And I could tell many stories, that is, as Mary Ann knows, that's what we carry with us, the stories of the folks that we have the privilege of living among. Yeah.
Okay. Gary, I'll get back to you, but I have a question here from Nancy, who says, are there any organizations in the U.S. who would help sponsor Venezuelans, organizations Venezuelans could tap to find sponsors?
That's a great question. I also wanted to add that I reached out, I now work with Maryknoll Office for Global Concerns, and reached out to fellow Maryknollers who are working on the border. I reached out to Sister Lil Mattingly and Heidi Cernica and Debbie Northern to ask them just this past week, what is the situation like right now at the border with Venezuelans? Because of this new format that Biden is offering for Venezuela. I was curious if they'd stop coming through. And so they still find that this new format of trying to get into Venezuela does not work for the majority of Venezuelans that they come across. They have nobody who would sponsor them. And so I think the situation in Venezuela is again, really different from many Central Americans or other nationalities, Mexicans, Haitians, who've had communities, expat communities here in the US for decades. And Venezuela really has had a kind of an upper middle class community, maybe in Miami. But so because of that, I think there is a real confusion of where to turn. And as many of you know, people were just randomly put on buses. We heard about the issue when they were sent to Martha's Vineyard, had no idea where they were going, but likewise, buses and busloads to Washington, to New York, to all over the country. And so I don't know of any particular specific Venezuelan organization that's trying to help reach out to them. I know that local communities have been extraordinary in receiving people. I've heard so many stories also of people, just going to the bus station literally and helping settle people, in the meanwhile. If anybody else, maybe somebody on this call might know of that.
Well, I see Sister Lil Hill. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Lil's there. Okay. Yeah.
Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, and thanks so much, Lisa and Rebecca and Marianne. It's been incredible to hear all the history and your experience, which is amazing. Yes, I cannot say much except that it's like being in limbo for the folks, the Venezuelans, and so many caught on the Mexico side, because they have been pushed back now that Title 42 includes them. So it's thousands, and we know the volunteers in Juarez, I'm in El Paso, who are feeding 400 to 600 a day at the cathedral where the Colombian mission is working. Yes, and where I go to a little shelter, the poor folks, it's just so hard because they're there long term, and like you, even on this now, desperate kind of thing, even though they have food, we have food and beds for them, but then they're there and others can't come. So it's limited. There, as far as an organization, I was just reading about something in a group in Dallas who is trying to help Venezuelans, or it has their name, and I haven't really gotten able to research that yet. But that's about all I can say. Thanks to all of you all. Yeah.
Thanks, Lil. Thank you for sharing. I know so many personal stories of Venezuelans who were trying to come. Some made it over, some made it to the border right before that decision to return Venezuelans on Title 42. And they're stuck. They're stuck there. And then some who have been able to come over, just really confused. And I know some people, like, Heidi wrote also that sometimes people don't even know where they're supposed to go, or they're called to fill out forms, or, it's just all very confusing.
Can I just add, sorry, something? I remembered that the director of Annunciation House, the network of shelters in El Paso, Ruben Garcia, is providing workshops with lawyers, trying to help the ones who are there to apply online. But I think it's the ones who have a chance for asylum. Mm-hmm. And, it kind of seems like the reasons the folks are coming from Venezuela, more economic.
Mhm.
And that doesn't count as asylum. That's the sad part. Because, but meanwhile, there's so many who have traveled. They got past paid a lot of money to get past the checkpoint, to get to Las Cruces, to get to Denver or whatever they're doing. I've heard of it. And so some of them are getting around, and people must be taking them in just like the buses, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So they're in they're adding to the 11 million undocumented, I guess.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. I see one hand up, and we'll hear from Gigi, but then after that, I think we'll close with Gary has a few questions and I will read those. So Gigi.
Okay. Hi, Lisa. Excuse my hoarse voice. Couple of things. I've heard that in addition to families now being able to accept Venezuelans who are applying from Venezuela to come here, other kinds of groups, church groups, etc., are able also to sponsor Venezuelans. And I wonder if you know anything about that. That's number one. Number two, statistically, our government is saying the number of Venezuelans trying to cross the border right now is down massively. I don't know if that's true or not. I believe our people on the border, maybe more than the government. And so I wondered about a comment on that. And maybe this is too many questions. My third question is the horror of sanctions. I am assuming we had sanctions just as severe on Chavez as we do on Maduro. And why under Maduro did it become so much worse? And how can we ever get our country to stop this horrible game of sanctions? So that's the array of stuff going on in my head. Answer what you would.
Thanks, Gigi, and good seeing you. You know, it's really good that you say the words sanctions and migration together, because, you know, every day I read different stories about Venezuelans in the US and people shocked, but we've caused it. You know, really, you know, in addition to a bunch of mismanagement, obviously on the part of Maduro and his administration, but really the great economic blow, the kick in the gut to Venezuela is US sanctions. And actually they didn't start until recent years. It went once Maduro, you know, into his term of office. They were not against Chavez. So so that is why there's so many people trying to go over the border. It's just impossible to raise a family really in Venezuela without some lifeline. And I do think that probably fewer people are coming through the border because, as Lil said, they now are turned back. I mean, for a set of months, Venezuelans, I think, and Nicaraguans, Cubans, and Haitians were exempt from the Title 42, which allows them to just be sent right back again. But so the first thing the Biden administration did to make that change was in October, where they said, well, actually, Venezuelans can be turned back. And so obviously they don't get through the border as they were getting through before. And then as a peace offer was this concept of visas for 30,000, but yeah, along with the work visa for 2 years, a work permit. But honestly, I don't know of any people I know in Venezuela who've been able to get that because they just don't have, you know, many people have asked me, will I sponsor them? I mean, I could just sponsor 100 people, but I actually can't because my last year's income was poverty income. So I don't even qualify for sponsoring anybody at this point. But in terms of organizations, again, maybe you all know that better than I do, but there's certainly a need for it. And I just want to say, you know, it's heartbreaking because Venezuela was such a country of immigrants, you know, just it's what made that country in the past many decades. It just opened its arms so welcomingly, and you know, to feel what they feel not only in the US, but I think they've had there's been a lot of xenophobia, a lot of pushback in other countries as well. So it also just goes to show how quickly instead of just a few years, a country's destiny can just really drastically change. Venezuela is a country, I think, where there's a lot of bad guys and the good guys aren't being given, you know, really a chance. And the bad guys, the US, the Maduro administration, the opposition, which has been very violent, China and Russia, which are trying to take advantage of all its resources. And so, can everybody's strategize together to bring us to our knees. And so the hope is when will people who are, just the regular people in Venezuela have a chance to turn things around?
All right, so a couple more questions from Gary. One, he asked, is China a good and more constructive partner for Venezuela? And then our final question for you from Gary is a more personal one. He wants to know what you're doing now in DC with Maryknoll, and what are your aspirations in this role?
Thanks, Gary. We connected a lot at different times with Venezuela with your amazing organization. So China, I would not use the word better partner. They are much bigger partner right now. They are hugely involved, especially in all of Latin America, but especially in South America. And China has a way of going about getting involved in which they don't really care about politics. They don't really care who's your president or what your system is. They want your resources, and they're very clear about that. And they want Venezuela's oil and gold, et cetera, and land. And so I'd say China, it's a more, I don't know if the word's sneaky, but Venezuela's been desperate, so it's accepted massive amounts of Chinese loans. But again, it owes so much of the nation already to China that I don't know how it could possibly, pay it off in decades. And so they owe themselves, their lives to China at this point. And so I would not necessarily say it's a bigger partner at this point, and it's a very it owns Venezuela's future. And I'm like, oh, what am I doing now? I am, as soon as I got back from Venezuela, I arrived here and said, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to work. I can't just grow food and bananas and, get by and grow my little pigeon peas. If I'm in the US, I've actually got to work. And so, fortunately I heard about Maryknoll, the Office for Global Concerns, having a position open, and Maryknoll has been my heart organization. I was a Maryknoll missioner for 21 years, and then worked with Roy, who was a Maryknoll priest, no longer is, but whose project was very much embraced by Maryknoll, the School of the Americas Watch. So it's been really a comfortable fit to go back to be with Maryknoll, although I'm learning a lot. I'm in a role, has a long title, but it basically is looking at economic and environmental issues and trying to bring those forward, listen to the voices of Maryknollers who are throughout the world looking at those issues, and enlighten different situations of climate change, environmental, different things happening with environmental changes and crises, and how we can respond to that at higher levels, but bring Maryknoll voices, bring voices from the South really to that issue. And so I've learned a lot. I've had to jump into things like, the big UN conference on climate. I've had an extraordinary learning experience of connecting with so many different partners, both here in the US, but also overseas as well. And so it's been a learning curve on the issue. My connection with environment was that I planted a lot of food. I know how to do that well. I really understand the land. I understand agroecology from the bottom up. And so to look at the overarching what's happening in our world and what we have to do to change that, to make that environment be able to continue our planet. And so that's what I'm doing.
Okay, well, thank you, Rebecca, for handling all of those questions so well, and thanks to those who posed them and made our discussion very rich tonight. But the big thank you to Lisa. Thank you.
Thanks.
Being with us, and for your work, the work that you have done all of these decades, and the work you're doing now, and I know that you will continue to do. It's been a long night, a long evening. I want to just once again remind everyone that we have 3 more wonderful talks coming up, one each month from now until May. All of them have been put in the chat, and I just want to at least say again that 1 month from tonight, on the 15th of March, Jose Artiga from the Share Foundation, someone that I have been working with a lot lately for the last several years on Honduran issues, and we just returned from a delegation in December to both El Salvador and Honduras. He himself is Salvadoran, came here in the 1980s, I think 1980, the first person in sanctuary in the United States in that era of the sanctuary movement. So well worth tuning into. So I hope we see all of you and let other people know that we have this series going on. Do some cut and paste from the chat. It'll be there for a few minutes so that you can get the other information too. So on behalf of Interfaith Council for Peace and Justice, our Latin America caucus, I thank you all for coming tonight, and hope to see all of you again. And a big shout out to all of the Maryknollers who showed up tonight. Great to see you. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne, and everybody. Your beautiful chats and presence. Love you guys.
Love you. Take care. Good night, y'all.